Stephen Birch almost doesn't need any introduction. It says here he's an associate professor of the Norwegian School of Health Sciences.
Could you speak up, please?
Yeah. No, let me speak up. I'll speak up. Is that up enough?
Yes.
Right. Christiania University College, Oslo, Norway. He practices in Amsterdam, Holland. He's been practicing acupuncture since 1982, specializing in Japanese acupuncture methods. In addition to his practice, he has been involved in scientific research on acupuncture since the late 1980s. He's been involved in the study of theory, development and practice of acupuncture since the mid-1980s and has written a number of books, including Extraordinary Vessels, Understanding Acupuncture, Shonishin, Japanese Pediatric Acupuncture, and Restoring Order in Health and Chinese Medicine. Stephen tells me that he teaches all over Europe, and when he's very lucky, he teaches in Australia and Brazil. So that's what I was told to say. Stephen.
Well, thank you. I should say a few words about myself. I'm not American, although many people think I might be. I lived there for 19 years. I'm really a Brit. I was born in Sheffield and raised in Lincolnshire. Couldn't wait to get away. I now live in Holland. Sorry for those of you who come from Lincolnshire. Today's topic is not something I would have done 10 years ago, this particular lecture. It started because this guy here, my friend Miguel, he told me about 9 years ago, I want to do a book about the meridians, the Jingmai. I want to approach Paul and Schultz and Vivian Lowe and Elizabeth Shue and all these scholars, and I'll do an edited book about the meridians. And can you help me? So I started saying, oh, okay, why not? And then next thing he says, oh, let's do it about Qi as well. Okay, that sounds interesting. And then all these scholars wrote back saying, oh, too busy, you've done it already, don't want to do it again. And then we had nobody to write anything. So the two of us said, well, but there's all this great scholarship out there, why don't we do it ourselves? And we thought, that's a lot of work. So we grabbed our friend Manuel and said, he's really good at working, let's get him to help. So the three of us published this book last year. And so what I'm going to talk about today is something that I think many of us kind of implicitly understand. If you've been practicing for a while, it becomes kind of obvious over time. But I think for me, this message is important not only as practitioners and how to improve ourselves as practitioners, but also it's important in terms of what we might teach our students. It's very important in terms of how we might approach doing research on this, on acupuncture. So I'm very fortunate in the sense that although I've specialized in Japanese acupuncture, this uses very different needling methods. I'm not going to do any treatment demonstrations or needling demonstrations today. My needling methods are really very different from what's done in China today. I often do needling where I don't actually insert the needle. That's really very different. Okay, and I think some of you may have seen a paper I published in eJOM a couple of years ago where I described the needling method and then I show you where it comes from in the Suwen and the Lingshu and the Nanjing. So you'll understand it's a kind of an attempt to reproduce classical ideas. And I've been very fortunate that I've studied with a lot of very experienced practitioners, each with 45 years or more experience. So this lot here, 45 years, 55 years, 50 years, 62 years, all the rest of them 45 plus years of experience. And then there's another slide of other teachers I could put up. What I find when I study with people with a lot of experience is it's not only that they've been treating a lot of patients for a long time, but they tend to have really stupidly simple theory. They don't take all this theoretical stuff or pay much attention to it anymore. It's always distilled down into something really basic. Okay? And instead, what they all focus on is practical skills. because they've become very good at those practical skills. They don't need so much theory to use the practical skills. So I want to talk briefly about how that, today's lecture is about how the classical literature, the historical literature has approached how you develop a practitioner, and what the importance of developing a practitioner is relative to how you do needling, or even the very act of trying to influence qi with a needle. Okay. So to do that, I want to talk about a little quick contrast between Western ways of thinking and East Asian ways of thinking. You should know I have a degree in philosophy from the University of Hull, which I got before Maggie Thatcher closed all the philosophy departments, which is probably a good thing to do, having studied philosophy. But in traditional East Asian thinking, knowledge is not so much the kind of knowledge that you have as what's called representational knowledge in scientific thinking. It's much more geared towards being able to act and being able to solve problems in the world. It's much more practically oriented. So often what you find scholars writing about this in the US, for example, a number of sinologists and who have been studying Chinese thinking say, well, you can't, when you ask the answer to a question of what is this is usually how to do it. So here's a kind of a famous example of that. Chun Yui, which hopefully many of you have heard of. He was a practitioner around 150. His work was described in a series of case histories in the Shiji, published around 90 BC. In his discussion of what is qi, his discussion of what is qi is how do you do it? You can read that, right? That's a typical example of attempting to describe something. What is this thing? It's how do you do it? It's a really typical example of thinking in East Asia. So, therefore, when we look at the kind of descriptions that you find in the classical literature, we have to approach it with a different lens than we might do reading a Western textbook. Okay? Just have a different way of thinking about the nature of things. Okay? So, the understanding of qi comes not so much through an intellectual analysis, it comes through acting correctly. Okay? The more the experience you have of doing that thing, in general, you should therefore start having a better understanding about that thing. And this is what I observe with my practitioners, my teachers, after practicing for many years, they just do it. And if you ask them theoretical questions about it, they smile and say, well, it's like this, and they do it. And one of my favorite things, I remember when I was back in the mid-1980s, first time in Japan with my teacher, I had this horribly complicated theoretical thing in my head, and I was really proud of it. And I turned to my teacher and said, what do you think? And he said, Junji, lay down, Steve, show me your theory on him. And my theory just vanished. It was gone. It doesn't work like that. So, anyway, because of this, the importance of, in order to understand some of these things, it's not just an intellectual endeavor, it's a practical thing. Therefore, you need to have some experience of this. So therefore, when we did this new book, which is available through AccuDate, I believe. Currently not present, but they're taking orders. When we did the book, we decided that it's better that we ask practitioners who've been doing it for a long time, and also practicing for a long time, but also have been looking behind what they practice to try to understand the origins of it, the nature of it, what I would call scholar practitioners, right? So, for example, if we look at the contributors in the book, many of these names, I think you know, everybody here has been doing whatever their discipline is minimum 30 years, some of them much more than that, and some of them several disciplines, acupuncture, tai chi, qigong, herbal medicine, etc. So these are people who've been working in the field for a long time, so that we had a better chance that we would capture that practical understanding, that practical grasp of these concepts, okay? So, put that aside, Because I'm an acupuncturist, I can only really talk about acupuncture. I can't really talk much about herbal medicine or massage, so I'm going to focus on what I do. The purpose of needling in the Ling Shu is to regulate the qi. Okay? Elizabeth Rochette de la Vallée says that's a definition of acupuncture. And in the 4th chapter in here, where I describe the relationship of how the concepts of qi and the meridians were used and why do we use the way that we used in relation to acupuncture, we show in the book how, as these concepts evolved and developed, they introduced metal needles as a technique for regulating qi. When they wanted to regulate qi in another person, as opposed to only in themselves, where you do these practices instead. Okay? So the very purpose of introducing metal things called jun or needles was for regulating qi. Okay? So this idea about regulating qi is something that developed coming out of the Warring States period, because in China during that time, as many of you know, most of you probably know, China was in a great state of turmoil. There was a lot of fighting going on. The country was really falling apart. A lot of internal fighting and so on. And therefore you see the development of these ways of thinking. Somebody like Confucius arises as an individual who could step beyond that and try to find ways of establishing order, restoring order in society. And what do you need to do to restore order in society? You need to cultivate somebody who can be a superior person, a sage, so that they can make sagely rulings on things and therefore help restore order in society. Okay? So, and also during this time you had the emperor had this special power, this Tianming, heaven's mandate. He was the only one talking with heaven. So therefore he was the only one that could impose heaven's will on earth. So therefore it was his job and only his job, and you all had to treat him really well and take care of him. So he usurped all power for himself. So although Confucius seemed to have supported that, that's a different story. But the whole idea is that on earth things are a bit chaotic. So we need some way of restoring order on earth in society, and the concept of qi emerges in this dialogue, in this discussion about how do you restore order in society by cultivating the individual who can impose order or spread order in society. And as this process was unfolding, there was a very important text called the Neiye. The Neiye is actually a very small chapter in a big book called the Guanzi. The Guanzi is basically a book of philosophy and history and politics. So therefore, most people didn't really pay a lot of attention to this chapter in the modern period because, the Guanzi is a book on politics and philosophy and history. It's not so interesting to us. But there are 4 chapters in the Neiye. 3 of them are called The Art of the Mind, about different ways of cultivating the mind. And the 4th one was called the Neiye, which in recent decades has been recognized to be really, really, really important. And there's a full translation of the Neiye available, done by an American professor, Harold Roth, not related to Philip. His book is called The Universal Tao, and I think you'll find it's a very nice translation and explanation. But basically the Neiye was instrumental in developing a model of a body, a physiology of the body, and what you need to do to improve the physiological state of the body so that you could cultivate yourself and become a superior person so that you could influence things in a positive way. In fact, Harold Roth argues that the Neiye is basically a meditation manual. He even argues it predates, it's the basis for which the Zhuangzi and the Tao Te Ching emerge. It's behind that. Not everybody agrees with that statement, but still, it underlies a lot of thinking that you see in the Neiye, in the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi. And also, scholarship in the last 15, 20 years has recognized that some of the ideas that emerge in the Neiye, that appear in the Neiye, lay the foundation for medical practice. Some have said this is the first physiological speculations about a body stuff going on in the body and what you can do about it, and it lays the foundations for all later medical speculations. Okay, so the idea of the Neige was that you do these various practice methods like meditation and breathing and proper posture, good diet, and very simple things, and then through that you cultivate your qi. As you cultivate your qi, you develop this more refined form of qi called jing, and you develop these two more and more and more and cultivate them more and more, and ultimately you invite Shen down from heaven into your body. And then now you're a superior person. And actually Araroth was very interesting. He says this was a political process because it was an attempt to replace the emperor's unique authority in society by empowering the individual. You understand? So it's a very interesting book. So in this process, what they describe in there probably lays the foundation for many of the things that we know in what's it called, the Yangsheng tradition. It lays the foundation for the pre-Neijing text that you find in the Jiangjia Maowangdui archaeological digs. And what we find in these texts in these two archaeological digs are descriptions of things called the Mai, which are probably related to the meridians. Certainly it's a precursor for the meridians. They are targets of treatment and diagnosis. They're palpable by diagnosis. He talks about palpating them and so on. And they're treated by pressure and bleeding and moxa and so on. So they're targets of diagnosis and treatment. So this model of the body emerges, and there's also the idea of the Mai as being maybe also related to this self-cultivation practices, though the arguments for that are still very limited. Sorry, there's a few things here. So these Mai contain qi and blood, but there's no circulation, there's no really articulated description about this qi and blood. Then we find, a few years later, the Neijing introduces something much more complicated. With the Su and the Lingshu, you start to see the appearance of the Jingmai, which is a much more sophisticated and very highly articulated concept, much more developed than the Mai, which brings together many different threads of thinking. Okay, you can find all of these different systems in it, including ethics. There's all kinds of things when you look at the scholarship of the literature as the Maowangdui, the Jiangjia Shan texts, and then how the Neijing texts arise. You can see all kinds of scholarship describing the influences of all these different processes. Okay, all this stuff comes into understanding about the Jingmai, and the Jingmai contain qi and they circulate endlessly. And now we've got a really clear target for diagnosis and treatment. Okay. The term Jing is introduced probably, we think, because although the term Jing is used to refer to a text like the Neijing, it also means that vertical threads in a fabric. We all know this, the warp and the woof, right? Whereas the luo vessels are the horizontal threads, right? But as the vertical threads in the fabric, it lays the skeleton for everything else. So therefore, scholars understand and translate the term Jing as to order, to bring regularity, to align. The term Jing means to order. Okay, although it refers to vertical threads in a fabric, this is how the concept is usually understood. So you get many scholars, when they see this term before the Neijing, in literature before the Neijing, it's translated like this. Okay, so Elizabeth Rochette de la Vallée says the term Jingmai means something like ordering the vessels. So the very function, the very nature of the meridians, the Jingmai, is about helping maintain and restore order in the body. And we target treatment to the Jingmai to restore order to the Jingmai so that they can then restore order in the body. And that's why metal needles are introduced. Okay? In order to do this, they introduced another new concept, the meridians, the shui. sorry, the points, the shui, and these metal things called the jump, which you apply to the points to regulate the qi. And you're supposed to diagnose the excess and deficiency of the 12 meridians, and by correcting the imbalance of the 12 meridians, that restores order in the system. And that's the fundamental reason for the development of the Jinmai, introduction of needles, how the acupuncture points arose. Rather than just stimulating somewhere on the line, it gives you specific targets to produce specific kinds of influences and regulatory effects. Okay. So and after this we start to see the appearance of strategies for restoring order in the body. And as they do this, as the Neijing is describing this, they borrow a lot from earlier discussions from the Confucian and the Taoist texts about how to cultivate the superior practitioner, the superior person. And the language of the practitioner who's able to do these things with a needle is similar to the language of the person who's cultivating themselves to be the superior person in the Confucian type traditions or the Mencian or etc. type traditions. Okay? So there's a lot of discussions in the Neijing and Nanjing about the superior practitioner compared to the inferior or average practitioner. As I said, and a lot of that borrows from these earlier discussions. And the core idea that you find in these earlier traditions is that when somebody does these things to create this change in themselves so that they become this superior person, able to influence society in a positive way, they do that by aligning themselves with heaven. And you align yourself with heaven because that's the highest level of order there is. If you can align yourself with that, you can naturally import that into yourself, and then you can export that to society. Okay? So originally that was the idea of what the emperor was doing, but then it was taken on as what the individual can start to do beside the emperor. Okay? So, and what you're trying to do is you're trying to cultivate your de. If you can cultivate your de, which is multiply translated here, I simply put virtue. This is the de of the Tao De Jing, right? If you're able to cultivate this, therefore you can maximize your effects on society. And just as a quick aside, in the discussions about the nature of qi, one of the things that we found was in the discussion of qi, there's a very clear idea about how it might act in the world. It's by a kind of resonance, what's called yin or gang yin, right? And the idea of cultivating this person is that you can create this resonance in the people around you and therefore order society just by being ordered yourself. That's the basic idea. Okay? Whether we think it's real or makes any sense or not, this is the language of what they were saying and describing. Okay? So, in order to create this virtue, develop this virtue, you should align yourself with heavenly qi. Today that means weather, doesn't it? The meanings changed a little bit. But they meant something a bit different in those days, this heavenly qi. So according to Mencius, the heavenly qi, which you have to import into your body, it sets the stage for the person to become virtuous. This is a qi that's extremely vast and unyielding, etc., etc. So at the time of this, when texts are talking about these kind of things, they're often talking about qi and ethics and virtue in the same sentences. It's very interesting. It's not how we normally think when we study our acupuncture books, right? So another text, the Guodian, this was lost for a long time, but another of those archaeological digs that was found in recent decades. Sages know the way of heaven. Knowing something and putting it into practice is righteousness. Practicing something with the appropriate timing is virtue. I'm going to come back to this because this issue about practicing with the appropriate timing is a really, really important concept when it comes to needling. It's also an important concept in many areas in life, but this is something that we'll come back to. Okay? So, what's involved in becoming a sage? Well, Confucius said a lot of things about this, but one of the most important things is you have to master your emotions and your desires. Okay? There's a famous statement about if the person who wants to be the ruler, well, yeah, okay, you want to be the one that rules out over there and rules all the stuff into here. Well, first, you've got to get this under control. When this is under control, you can rule your family. And if you can rule your family, you can rule this group, and then it expands back out to society. Okay? So there's very clear articulations about this in discussion, and the term qi is introduced in this discussion in Confucius. Okay? So, in order to regulate your emotions, you have to regulate your qi. Why am I saying that? Because in the early literatures, in Confucian and Taoist literatures, controlling your emotions was tantamount to regulating your qi. That was the first step. And this is to do with the fact that emotions at that time, and explicitly in the Suen, when they talk about the 7 emotions, there's a chapter which says, this emotion is this disordered movement of qi. That emotion is that disordered movement of qi. So, by definition, any emotion, not I'm very, very angry, but just anger is a disordered movement. It creates a disordered movement of qi, and it manifests from a disordered movement of qi. They are identical. This is not our normal way of thinking about things, okay? So, if emotions by definition are a disordered movement of qi, therefore the first step to regulating qi is regulating your emotions. Right? That's really pretty straightforward. And this is a very recurrent theme in the earlier literatures and so on. A lot of different authors have added to this. You find when Buddhism arrived, several centuries later, it had quite fertile ground upon which to grow, because this is another important theme in Buddhist thinking as well. So here's an example from the Li Ji, which is reputedly a Confucian text. From the first moment of his existence, a man's heart is a place of absolute calm. I'll come back to what I mean by heart. It's free of all desire. I'll just let you read that for a moment. Okay. So external objects act on it and produce diverse movements and so on. And so it goes on a little bit here. In the presence of these external objects, man has the faculty to know them, etc. So here we go. By letting yourself be drawn and developing these desires, you're incapable of returning within yourself, and you lose, ultimately, these good influences from heaven.
Steve, is this in your book?
Yes. So if I'm going too fast...
There's a reason.
No, but I only have 3 hours, and this is really a one-day lecture or a weekend workshop. So the important thing is this concept of heart, the shin, is very, very important. This is also very in this whole process of cultivating qi and cultivating the practitioner. The shin, the heart, is very important. Now, in the term shin is multiply understood. Today, if you see this term in a TCM textbook, it's just translated as the heart. Okay, which is okay. It is that. It does refer to that. However, the term shin in general, in East Asian thinking and in the early medical literature, often you don't know what it means. It could be the heart, the physical thing in the body that beats, or it could also be the mind. Because every single emotion, every single mental state has this character in it. It underpins all the mental and emotional states. So, therefore, many people translate the term shin as the heart-mind or the mind-heart, because scholars have a difficult time differentiating what are you referring to, or should we even try to say two different things? It's the heart-mind. It's the same thing. Okay? This focus on the heart-mind is very important in the Neya, very important in Zhuangzi, and what they have to say is very influential for the medical literature. So Zhuangzi talks about letting your heart-mind roam in the flavorless Blend your chi with the featureless, and so on. Okay, here's a nice quote from Zhuangzi. Let you read this. And don't look, don't listen, embrace the spirit by means of stillness, and the physical form will correct itself. This concept of stillness we're going to come back to. This is one of the important recurrent themes in the self-cultivation literatures in China, and also in the literature on needling. Okay? So if we're able to do it right, the heart-mind becomes more still. In the early, I think it's the next quote, yes, in the early literature they have this an idea that the heart-mind, you find it as a recurrent theme in multiple texts, the heart-mind wants to be still, that's its proper nature. When it's still, you can see things clearly. So the idea is like, if you have water, and the water is completely level, you can see your reflection in it. But any disturbance of the water distorts your reflection, and what you're looking at and perceiving becomes distorted, or you simply can't see it at all. Okay? So they use this analogy of like the heart, mind, and the level of water as being like a mirror. Okay? And the heart mind is disturbed by emotions, and emotions cause the water to do this. Now you can't see properly. So you understand that the analogy in here, okay? So if they rest, they become empty. If they become empty, then they are filled. So this is another important thing. Stillness and emptiness are recurrent themes in the discussion of self-cultivation and how chi comes into the body and is cultivated. Okay? This is a recurrent theme related to. So here's another one. I'm going to come back to this several times, a little bit later today. Make your will one. Don't listen with your ears, listen with your mind. No, don't listen with your mind, listen with your chi. The important thing here is, this is an effort to describe three ways of perceiving and acting in the world. There's a kind of a beginner level, where, okay, you've got ears, you can listen. Okay? And then there's another level, where you perceive, not focus only on the limited sensations that might come in through one of your sensory organs, but on the whole, your mind perceives things in a different level. There's a higher level of perception, and there's some very nice publications talking about this. There's a famous quote from Zhuangzi. And then perceiving with your chi means that there's no longer a separation between you and it, because everything is chi. So now there's no possibility of error. It's 100% perception. And you're one with it. Okay? So they had this idea about, Zhuangzi articulated it in these three stages here, and several other authors also have described this, the stages of development of the individual's ability to perceive and act. At this level, now this is the work of the master, the sage, etc. But he also it goes on about how vital energy is empty and waits on all things. This is his way by which chi gathers in the body. Right? If you can do this, then chi accumulates in the body. Okay. Also, he talks about, Zhuangzi has this nice quote about cook, who's very famous because he can take a knife and he can just slice through the ox like this, and the ox just falls apart. Right? So Zhuangzi goes up and says, "Oh, what are you doing? That's really cool. Please explain to me how you can do that." And his answer is, what I care about is the way, the Tao. It goes beyond mere technique. First I was just cutting up the ox. All I could see was the ox. After 3 years I no longer saw the ox as a whole, and now I meet it with my shen. And with my shen I can slice up this ox like. That's not how we normally think about shen, is it? What do you think he was trying to say using this kind of analogy, right? Okay. My sensory knowledge is restrained. My spiritual desires are allowed to move or act. I follow the heavenly pattern. As he said, I think we should be careful and go back and rethink our understanding of some of these early concepts, and how we might think about them in the modern period, and try not to impose our modern understanding of the English words, spirit, onto what the Chinese might have meant. So, for example, Dan Bensky, in translating that term, says, well, actually, in many instances in the early literature, it's more like the word knack. You just have this great skill, you can just do it. That's when the Shen's going on, right? In terms of the Shen, here's an early commentary, 3rd century commentary on the I Ching. To understand the first inklings, this is spiritual understanding, Shen. Literally, this is Shen. The first inklings are the suggestion of movement. This is an important thing because this is quoted in the Tai Chi tradition. Tai Chi Chuan uses this. They talk about this kind of idea. If you're in a conflict with somebody, like in a battle with somebody, a martial art fight, your ability to perceive the beginning of movement before the movement begins means that you're able to act before they act, and you'll win. That's Shen. Okay. This is the issue of timing again. And this term here, this first inklings, is a cognate of this term, G, which is going to come up in a few minutes. You hang on there, it'll become relevant in acupuncture very soon, okay? But this is an important term. Usually it's translated as mechanism. Dan Bensky and Chip Chase translated it as dynamic, which is it's possibly closer than mechanism anyway. But this is a very important concept related to your ability to do something very skillful with an acupuncture needle. But we'll be writing about carpentry. It will be also relevant in carpentry or in playing a violin, etc. It has relevance in many instances, but we're talking about acupuncture. So Zhuangzi's quite clear in articulating a number of concepts and ideas and laying out a kind of the relationship of cultivating the mind and how the qi becomes involved in that, the Shen becomes involved in that. The Neiye is much, much more explicit about this. So the core idea in the Neiye is cultivate your body by doing body work. Make sure you've got good posture. They constantly refer to being aligned, okay? And the term aligned is Jing, from Jingmai, okay? And then doing these mental exercises, and doing these physical exercises, and doing certain kinds of breathing techniques, and controlling and regulating your emotions, etc. And as I described earlier, you cultivate through this, you sort of develop your qi, you cultivate your jing, you then invite qi, Shen now from heaven, and you become more able. So when you become more able, you're able to do all of this other stuff. But if you're not able to control your emotions, it doesn't work. So therefore, get rid of your emotions, regulate them at least. Make sure everything's calm and quiet. Stillness is very important. And naturally, things start to develop when things are in this more still state. If you can be aligned and tranquil, only then can you be stable. And when you have a stable mind at your core, and your eyes and ears are not distracted, and they're clear, the four limbs, etc., then the vital essence, that's the Jing, starts to develop. Okay. So this is the language of the Neiye. By doing these kind of simple practices, the Qi, etc., starts to develop. And then when this starts to happen, your body starts to become really clear, etc. The muscles become supple, the bones become strong. This language that we see here about when you're able to gather this qi in your body and cultivate it, this nice stuff starts happening. The stuff that happens to the body, this language here, it's mirror imaged in language that talks about the arrival of qi. I think we'll come back to that later in here. When the qi arrives, then your body and your buttocks are firm and tight, and so on and so on. I don't know why that one. In the language of the arrival of qi, certainly in the self-cultivation literature. But this is this kind of language of the arrival of chi, of what's going on in the body when the chi arrives, okay? And you're also able to perceive things with great clarity. So posture, breath, mental attitude, emotional state, or habits, etc., all involved in cultivating your chi. And more refined things start to develop. I mentioned all this. So once this flow of vital energy is achieved, then all in the heavens will submit, meaning now you're ready to be the boss. You can go out there and rule. Okay? That's the idea. But it's not so easy. That's not a straightforward thing everybody can just plug in and do it. It's not like a matrix download you stick in the back of your head, bam, I can do it. This is a lot of work. Okay? It's not so easy. And you cannot force it. The Tao Te Ching, how often does the Tao Te Ching use the term chi? How can, what do you think? 100, 10, 20, 50? 3. Okay. This is one of the times. If the heart-mind directs the chi, this is called forcing. It doesn't work. You can't make it happen. You have to let it happen. It's a very explicit language in the early Taoist literature. A very explicit language. You can't make it happen, you have to let it happen. This forcing is not a positive thing. Okay? The Neya says it the following way, therefore this vital energy, that's Harold Ross' translation for chi, cannot be halted by force, yet can be secured by your inner power, cannot be summoned by speech. It's like you can't go out, like you call your cat, you get home, hey kitty, come on. Unless you've got food in your hand, he's never going to come over. Right? That's not how cats behave. Cannot be summoned by speech, and can be welcomed by your E. Okay? Now this is a very important sentence, this one here, because we see this as now the foundation for how to make stuff with a needle happen. This is the language of it here. This. You can't force it to happen. You've got to get into this cultivated state of mind called E in order to allow the chi to welcome it to come so that you can do something with it. That's the language of the Neya. That's the language of needling in the Suan and Ling Shu. Okay? So, chi can't be forced into the body. It's only by the power of your E, which I translate here, 3 different words, intention, attention, and awareness. We'll come back to that later, okay? That chi is welcomed into the body, where E is a kind of higher state of the mind. When you're able to do all that, you can see, perceive things with great clarity. Harmony naturally develops. Even the far off will see close at hand. It's like you develop telescopic vision or something. And once this flow of vital energy achieved, all in the heavens will submit. Right. So that's the ultimate purpose of doing this in the Neya. So, what's E? Well, I know many people, certainly many textbooks translate the term E as intention. And if you think about it, I assume we're all practitioners here. Okay, a patient comes to me, of course I have the intention to get him better. Whether I'm a first-year acupuncture student, or a third-year acupuncture student, or been practicing 10 years or 50 years, of course I have the intention to get him better. That doesn't mean I'm going to get him better. It's not some magical power, right? So I think the term intention is a very not so helpful word to understand E. So what have different scholars said about it? Well, in the in the chapter on Chi, where we talk about E and Jur, and we give the multiple translations that people have for this term, this is just a sampling of typical translations. A lot of different understandings of what that word means. And we'll see later, I like to use intention, attention, awareness as expressions of 3 different stages of cultivation of your E. Where the beginner only has intention, because they haven't cultivated anything, the abilities yet. But once you start to cultivate the abilities, then maybe E acts differently, and so we need a different word for it. Got it? So here's another definition of mental capacity that precedes thought: the image rather than the concept of a thing, and the movement action upon which one responds. E is a process of self-cultivation. That's another definition from one person. So, of E, Guo Yu, who was a Han Dynasty physician, says, medicine is E. All medicine is E. I think some of you have seen this. Volkerscheid and Dambensky wrote a very nice article in 1999 or something in eJob. Fantastic article about using this idea of medicine is E and then explaining it. And it goes on to say something about needling and how easy it is to screw up. An error of a hair's breadth will mean failure. Okay? A kind of spirit connects the physician's heart with his hand. And that's something I can know but not explain. Okay? So, we'll see this, we'll come back to this. I think actually, maybe it comes up here. Okay. Also, Sun Tzu Miao also said the same thing, medicine is E. And continues, those who are proficient in using E are good doctors. Those who match the correct type of medicine with the appropriate condition can be considered superior craftsmen. So therefore it is said medicine is E. He mostly did herbal medicine. He did do other things too. So therefore for him, when he talks about medicine, he's mostly thinking about the ability to prescribe herbs well to help you. Whereas the other author was an acupuncturist. Guo Yu was an acupuncturist, so for him, the term E referred to something that you need to be able to do in order to influence qi with a needle properly. So, Su 162 tells us, in this way you stabilize your intentions. This is to do with needling techniques. You have to stabilize your intentions and then you can do this. This is Unschult's translation of E. This E is important in the practice of medicine, the art of needling. But what does it mean, medicine is E? All aspects of medical practice are related to your E. I keep thinking of that Monty Python movie. What was it? Search for the Holy Grail. I'm sorry I'm English, I just can't help this stuff. It helps keep you alert at least anyway. What is E that it could play such a role? Well, basically what I would say is the following. E is an internal state that arises from a quiet, calm attention or awareness. It results from good posture, calm mind, calm emotions, a kind of quiet, non-focused awareness. These seem to be important in welcoming the qi. This is the language of the Neya. As I said, you'll see it mirrored in the language of needling. Okay? So E is a sort of a higher cultivated state of the mind. Okay. Oops. I said all that. So now, the scholars have also pointed, as I mentioned earlier, that these descriptions have influenced the language of needling and so on. They influenced the acupuncture literature, described physiological models, became the foundation of needling. The language of how to do something with a needle seems to be also influenced by the Neya. So here we find this this idea is not, it's carried from the Neya forward into other early historical texts. This is one from the Jianjiashana medical text. This text here, be quiescent in order to treat them. So in order to do this thing with a needle when you're needling the mai, or treating the mai, you have to be quiescent. And this is a very important feature, this quietness. Because here we have the language of needling. The practitioner must deeply reside in a place of stillness and divine the comings and goings of the spirit with one's sensory doors and windows shut. This is from Chip Chase's translation. He did an article published in 2006 in the Australian journal Lantern, where he looked at this passage from Ling Shu chapter 9 and said, wow, that's a virtual mirror image passage of this meditation passage that you find in the Neya. So his article actually describes the parallels, and that virtually the language of needling is a parallel for the language of meditation. You got it? It's about getting the practitioner into this state, and then the needle can be more active. You can do more with it. Okay? Lucia chapter 1 also tells us those who would examine disease must calm their minds when gazing upon a patient, looking neither left or right. We call that spaced out. Okay, Sue 25 also gets into the same kind of issues. The sentiments are calm and one concentrates on what is right. This way one observes the changes as they happen. This is what's called the obscure. This obscure is a very strange, I don't have time to get into it, but that's an important concept in the Tao Te Ching. Okay, and then we also have these other ones. You have to be calm as though you're looking over a deep abyss, and the hand must be strong as if it held a tiger. Now that's really curious. This passage, translated by Chinese influenced practitioners, insert words, must be strong. You've got to be really strong to be able to grab a tiger's tail, right? My teachers in Japan translating the same passage, they don't talk about strength, they talk about you don't want to wake the sleeping tigers, otherwise he's going to kill you. So you need to be able to grab that tail so quietly he doesn't wake up. That's a completely different thing than strong. It's very interesting, the cultural difference, the Japanese, Chinese cultural differences there. Suwen 54 also tells us, first of all, rectify your spirits, since your regard to the patient will call for the regulation of his spirits, hence the chi circulates with ease. In other words, get your own stuff better, then you can make the stuff in the patient better. The term stuff is an official translation to chi. If you're not familiar with that, it's one of those, there's multiple authors have translated the term chi as stuff. I actually quite like it. It avoids actually trying to say anything meaningful about what is chi by calling it stuff. Okay? So, changes in yourself allow the chi in the patient to circulate with ease. So I practice this method. Some of you have studied it with me, some of you have seen it or heard about it. I've written about it as well. This needling method in Japanese Brilliant Therapy, it's a style of that called Toyohari, where when we're training people in this, okay, I'm needling a point on a patient, the teacher on the pulse, and I have colleagues or other teachers on other pulses on the person. When I touch, the person's pulse changes. Can I touch and make the pulse better, but just by touch? Or does my touch make the pulse worse? And when I touch and I say I'm on a point, is the pulse better or is it not better? If I'm not on the point, it's not better. When I'm on the point, the pulse improves. If my touch is good, right? So, and what usually influences how well I touch is whether I'm holding tension in my body. If I'm holding tension in my body when I touch, the pulse gets hard. And when I relax and release that tension, the pulse immediately softens. This is really weird. And I'm really surprised that in other traditions of acupuncture, nobody else noticed this, because it's so obvious. Okay? But anyway, doing stuff in yourself makes the chi in the patient change for the better. It circulates with ease. So, it's not only about self-cultivation of the practitioner, it's not very easy to do. It's the hallmark of a superior practitioner. So the superior practitioner is, basically that passage says, if you want to be a superior practitioner, pay attention to the meridians. Okay, so I'll summarize that for you. So we have to focus on the meridians if you want to be a superior practitioner. And this makes sense because the meridians, as I said earlier, are a kind of auto-regulatory system for the chi in the body. Okay? And if you pay attention to the meridians and you restore order in the meridians, that restores order in the rest of the body, which is the purpose of needling. Okay? The Neijing and Nanjing also have various discussions of the superior physician, especially related to needling itself. And here I'd like to start looking at the process of needling, and I want to acknowledge the fantastic work of Chip Chase and Dan Bensky in this. When when my friends Miguel and Manuel and I first started this process, we hadn't thought to include this translation from Chip Chase and Dan Minsky because they hadn't done it yet, right? We were sitting at dinner over eating tempura and sushi, which my wife cooks very, very well. So we're enjoying ourselves. And Miguel drags out this book and says, "Oh, I've got this term G here. What's this term G? What does it mean? It's really important in Tai Chi," which is a different G, right? "It's very important in Tai Chi. What do you think it means?" And I went, "Oh, it means mechanism. I'm not really sure. What else? What do you think, Chip?" So Chip says, "Oh," and so he consulted his little dictionary, and he's got this, I don't know, very electronic big database. So he's looking it up, and it's really cool. So I ran upstairs, and I come running down with my copy of the Ling Shu, and I said, "But the term G comes up all over the place in this chapter, Ling Shu chapter 1. It's all over the place in here. It must be important, no?" So Chip looked at it and went, "Wow," and then translated it. I brought Dan Bensky in to translate it with an annotated commentary. It was first published in, again, The Lantern in Australia, and then we included it in here. So I just want to acknowledge their work because they did a very, very good job explaining this passage. I think it's 18 lines that describes the essence of needling and contrasts the difference between the superior practitioner and the average practitioner. But it's like the core. Many other descriptions of needling in the Su Wen and Ling Shu are later commentaries on this passage. It's considered to be the oldest passage describing the act of needling and regulating qi with a needle. And almost all of the passages in the Su Wen and Ling Shu are commentaries on that passage, trying to explain it. Okay? So, Ling Shu chapter 1 tells us this: the crude attend to the form, the superior attend to the spirit. Well, okay, that makes sense. So we should pay attention to not just the mechanics of the needling itself, but you have to pay much more attention to what's going on within yourself and within the patient. Okay. Ling Shu chapter 1 also tells us the crude attend to the junctures, whatever you might understand that to mean. Often that's understood as a term that might refer to like the points or something. The superior attends to the dynamic. Now this is important. Here we see this term G appearing again. Ling Shu chapter 3, the superior attends to the dynamic means that they know how to attend to the qi. Okay. Ling Shu chapter 3 is a definite commentary on Ling Shu chapter 1. Okay. The Lei Jing also comments on this, that the superior protect the dynamic means that they must examine the movement and quiescence of the arrival of qi. Okay. Ling Shu chapter 1 continues. The movement in the dynamic is not separate from its empty spaces. The dynamic within this empty space is clear, still, and subtle. Okay? So they add to this, okay? Superior practitioner executes techniques of tonification within the empty spaces between the comings and goings of the qi in a calm and focused state of mind. So the basic idea, they say, is you need to stay out of the way of what's going on to let it happen. And you're using the needle to manipulate it as it's going on, but you kind of stay out of the way of this. Okay? Whether meeting it or following it by means of your E, you harmonize it. Okay, so this E is now, again, this is the thing with, by means of your E, you're able to harmonize it, and by having this G. So this term G is usually understood to refer, it comes from like the mechanism in a crossbow. That's why it's translated as mechanism. Okay? But the term G refers to much more than that. Okay? It's like the ability to perceive things in a way that you can act with the right timing to create the perfect response. So, for example, you possibly don't know this, maybe some of you are aware of this, but there's quite a few references in the Neijing to needling and bows and arrows, crossbows, and things like this. So, the term G is related to the following kind of concept. I'm a bowman, I'm fighting a war, and I need to kill that guy on a horse, and he's riding really fast over there. And I'm standing here, and I'm trying to hit him and kill him. Okay? And if I don't let go with the perfect timing here, if I don't get it right, I miss him and nothing happens. Right? G is related to being able to line it up perfectly with the perfect timing so that I can kill him. I'm using this language deliberately to be a bit thought-provoking, okay? It doesn't refer only to being able to kill people, but this is a very, very important concept in martial arts. When they're fighting, you've all seen martial art movies, the ability to perceive the beginning of movement before the movement starts, as the person makes their decision to do something and act in a certain way, your ability to perceive that they're going to do that before they do it gives you the cutting edge and you'll win. Right? It's the same thing. So the G is very important, this ability. And as I said, the E, this attention, is also very important. This cultivated state of mind is what helps you develop this ability to act perfectly with the right timing. So, yes. Time for a tea break. Well, we'll just finish on this, just to say it again. I came back to this, I said I'd come back to this, quoting from the Gordian. Practicing something with the appropriate timing is the highest state, the virtue, right? If you're able to be in that highest state, it means you really can do it perfect with the perfect timing. Whether you're acting in society and like influencing groups of people, or whether you're acting on a patient with a needle, or whether you're doing, oh sorry, there's other things in here. We'll see, there's many other ways of acting where this is very important. So, quick tea break? Should I do a quick question before a tea break?
It's up to you.
5 minutes. Quick question, anybody got a question?
I've got a question.
Yep.
You mentioned metal needles.
Yep.
Was it always metal?
Well, they had other non-metal tools that were applied for either bleeding or pressing. But yes, the germs were metal tools.
Lightweight.
Yes.